Maria Elena Rodriguez had always been the quiet girl in the corner of her college classroom. She studied languages not because she dreamed of adventure, but because words came naturally to her. While other students struggled with conjugations and pronunciation, she absorbed new languages like a sponge soaking up water. Italian had become her passion during her junior year, sparked by a random elective that fit her schedule. She never imagined that her linguistic skills would lead her into the most terrifying and life-changing evening of her 22-year life. The invitation came through her roommate Jessica, whose boyfriend Tony had connections she never fully understood. Jessica was the type of person who collected invitations to exclusive parties like some people collected stamps. She thrived on the energy of crowded rooms and expensive champagne, while Maria Elena preferred quiet cafes and library corners. "Come on, Elena," Jessica had pleaded, using the shortened version of her name that only close friends were allowed to use. "It's just one night. Tony says it's going to be incredible. Some Big Shot's family is celebrating something important, and they're throwing this massive party at this gorgeous mansion upstate." Maria Elena had tried every excuse she could think of. She had studying to do, she didn't have the right clothes, she wasn't good with strangers. But Jessica was persistent, and eventually Maria Elena found herself reluctantly agreeing, mostly to stop the constant begging. The dress Jessica loaned her was simple but elegant, a deep navy blue that complemented Maria Elena's dark hair and olive complexion. As they drove through the winding roads leading to the estate, Maria Elena felt her stomach churning with nervousness. She had no idea what kind of world she was about to enter. The mansion appeared through the trees like something from a movie set. Tall iron gates opened automatically as their car approached, and the circular driveway was lined with luxury vehicles that probably cost more than her family's annual income. Soft golden light spilled from every window, and the sound of laughter and music drifted through the evening air. Inside, the party was already in full swing. The rooms were filled with people who moved with a confidence that money and power typically provided. The men wore perfectly tailored suits, and the women dripped with jewelry that caught the chandelier light with every gesture. Maria Elena felt completely out of place, but she tried to smile and blend in as Jessica immediately began working the room. She found refuge near a quiet corner where she could observe without being noticed. The conversations around her were a mixture of English and what sounded like Italian, though she couldn't make out individual words through the music and general noise. She was content to remain invisible when Jessica suddenly appeared at her elbow, slightly breathless with excitement. "Elena, you have to come meet Tony's friend Marco," Jessica said, grabbing her arm. "He's been asking about you." Before Maria Elena could protest, she was being pulled through the crowd toward a group of men near the fireplace. Marco turned out to be a tall, dark-haired man in his early 30s with kind eyes and an easy smile. He seemed different from the other guests, less flashy, more genuine. "So you're the famous Elena that Jessica keeps talking about," Marco said, extending his hand. "She tells me you're studying languages." "Just finishing my degree," Maria Elena replied, feeling herself relax slightly. "I focus mostly on Romance languages." "Impressive," Marco nodded. "I always admired people who could pick up languages easily. I can barely manage English properly, and it's my second language." They talked for nearly an hour about travel, books, and university life. Marco had a way of asking questions that made Maria Elena feel like her answers actually mattered. She was surprised to find herself laughing at his stories about growing up in a large Italian family in Brooklyn. The evening was turning out much better than she had expected when Marco suddenly straightened, his expression shifting to something more formal and respectful. "Excuse me for just a moment," he said quietly. "There's someone I need to greet." Maria Elena followed his gaze and saw an elderly man who had just entered the room. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Despite his age, He carried himself with unmistakable authority. The conversations around him seemed quiet as he passed, and people stepped aside with obvious deference. "Who is that?" Maria Elena whispered to Marco. "That's Don Giuseppe Torino," Marco replied in a low voice. "The guest of honor's father. He flew in from Sicily just for tonight." Maria Elena watched as the elderly man made his way through the room, accepting greetings and brief conversations with various guests. She noticed that people seemed nervous around him, choosing their words carefully. There was something about his presence that commanded respect, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. "He looks lonely," she observed, watching as the man stood slightly apart from the main crowd. Marco looked at her with surprise. "Lonely? Don Giuseppe? I don't think anyone has ever described him that way before." But Maria Elena had always been good at reading people, and despite the man's commanding presence, she could see something in his posture that reminded her of her own grandfather when he attended social events where he didn't quite fit in. There was a certain isolation that came with being set apart from others, even when that separation was born from respect rather than rejection. "Maybe someone should talk to him," she suggested. "Really talk to him, not just pay their respects." Marco stared at her as if she had suggested walking into a lion's den. "Elena, you don't understand. Don Giuseppe isn't someone you just approach for casual conversation." But Maria Elena had inherited a stubborn streak from her grandmother, and something about the elderly man's isolation bothered her. She had spent enough time feeling like an outsider herself to recognize the signs in others. "What's the worst that could happen?" she asked, though even as she said it, she noticed the way Marco's face went pale. "You really don't want me to answer that question," he replied. Despite Marco's obvious concern, Maria Elena found herself walking toward Don Giuseppe before she could change her mind. Her heart was beating fast, but she had committed herself to the path, and backing down now would only make her feel foolish. The elderly man was standing near a large window that overlooked the estate's gardens, holding a glass of what appeared to be expensive whiskey. Up close, she could see the fine details of his appearance. His suit was impeccably tailored, his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his silver hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour. "Buonasera, signore," she said softly, hoping her pronunciation was correct. "Come sta questa sera?" Don Giuseppe turned toward her with raised eyebrows, clearly surprised to hear Italian spoken by someone so young. His sharp eyes studied her face for a moment before a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Bene, grazie, signorina," he replied, his accent thick with the sounds of southern Italy. "E lei? Come si chiama?" "Mi chiamo Maria Elena," she responded, pleased that she was managing to keep up with the conversation. "È una festa molto bella." "Indeed, it is a beautiful party." Don Giuseppe switched to English, though he continued to watch her with interest. "But you speak Italian very well for someone so young. Where did you learn?" "At university," Maria Elena explained. "I study languages, and Italian is my favorite. There's something about the way the words flow together that feels like music." Don Giuseppe's smile became more genuine. "You speak like someone who truly loves the language, not just someone who memorized textbook phrases. Have you ever been to Italy?" "Not yet," Maria Elena admitted. "But I dream about visiting Sicily someday. I've read so much about the history, the culture, the food. It sounds like the most beautiful place in the world." Something in Don Giuseppe's expression shifted, becoming warmer and more nostalgic. "Sicily is indeed beautiful, though it can be a harsh place as well. I have not been back to my village in many years, but I still dream about the lemon groves and the way the morning light hits the mountains." They continued talking, and Maria Elena found herself drawn into stories about Don Giuseppe's childhood in a small town outside Palermo. He told her about helping his mother tend their small garden, about the festivals that brought the whole community together, about the way his grandmother would spend hours preparing Sunday meals that seemed to feed half the neighborhood. "Your grandmother sounds wonderful," Maria Elena said. "She reminds me of my own abuela. She's from Mexico, but she has that same way of showing love through food." "Ah, the grandmothers," Don Giuseppe chuckled. "They are the true rulers of their families, no? They may seem gentle, but they have iron wills." "Exactly," Maria Elena laughed. "My abuela is tiny, but when she speaks, everyone listens." As their conversation continued, Maria Elena noticed that other guests were starting to stare. People seemed shocked to see her talking so casually with Don Giuseppe, and she caught several whispered conversations happening behind hands and champagne glasses. Marco kept shooting her worried looks from across the room. But Don Giuseppe seemed to be enjoying himself, and Maria Elena was genuinely fascinated by his stories. He had a way of describing places and people that made them come alive in her imagination. She could almost taste the fresh bread from his village bakery and smell the jasmine that climbed the walls of his childhood home. "You know," Don Giuseppe said thoughtfully, "it has been a long time since someone asked me about the old country with such genuine interest. Most people want to talk business or pay empty compliments. But you listen like you truly care about the stories." "I do care," Maria Elena said honestly. "History isn't just dates and facts in textbooks. It's real people living real lives, making choices that affect their families for generations. Your stories are part of that history." Don Giuseppe studied her face carefully. "You are an unusual young woman, Maria Elena. Tell me, what do you plan to do with your language studies when you graduate?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," she admitted. "Maybe translation work or teaching or something with international business. I just know I want to use languages to help people understand each other better." "Understanding," Don Giuseppe repeated slowly. "Yes, that is important. Too often, people make judgments without truly understanding the complexities of a situation." There was something in his tone that suggested deeper meaning, but before Maria Elena could ask what he meant, a younger man approached them. He was probably in his 40s, with the same sharp eyes as Don Giuseppe, but a more modern style of dress. "Papa?" the man said carefully, glancing at Maria Elena with obvious surprise. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Antonio," Don Giuseppe replied. "I was just enjoying a conversation with this intelligent young woman. Maria Elena, this is my son Antonio." Antonio extended his hand politely, but Maria Elena could see the questions in his expression. She was clearly not the type of person who typically engaged his father in lengthy conversations at family gatherings. "Piacere di conoscerla," Maria Elena said, offering her hand and another attempt at Italian. Antonio's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Your Italian is quite good," he said in English. "Papa, you've been holding court in your native language?" "She speaks beautifully," Don Giuseppe confirmed with obvious pride. "Better than my grandchildren, if I am being honest." "Don Giuseppe was telling me about Sicily," Maria Elena explained to Antonio, "about the village where he grew up. It sounds incredible." "It was a different world then," Antonio said, his expression softening as he looked at his father. "Papa doesn't often talk about the old days." "Sometimes it takes the right listener to bring out the stories," Don Giuseppe said meaningfully. The conversation was interrupted when Jessica appeared at Maria Elena's side. Her face flushed with what looked like a combination of excitement and panic. "Elena, there you are," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Maria Elena could sense the tension radiating from her friend and realized that her impromptu conversation might have caused more of a stir than she had anticipated. Around them, the party continued, but she was beginning to notice that many of the other guests were stealing glances in their direction. "I should probably let you get back to the other guests," Maria Elena said politely to Don Giuseppe, though she was genuinely reluctant to end their conversation. Nonsense, Don Giuseppe replied firmly. I am exactly where I want to be, but perhaps we should sit down. These old bones are not as patient as they used to be. He gestured toward a quiet seating area near the fireplace, and Maria Elena found herself following him, acutely aware that they were now the center of attention for much of the room. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness and genuine curiosity was about to transform an ordinary evening into something that would be talked about for years to come. As they settled into the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, Maria Elena became increasingly aware of the unusual quiet that had fallen over the nearby guests. Conversations continued, but at a lower volume, and she noticed people positioning themselves where they could observe her interaction with Don Giuseppe without appearing to stare directly. Don Giuseppe seemed either unaware of or unbothered by the attention. He leaned back in his chair and continued their conversation as if they were old friends catching up, rather than strangers who had met less than an hour ago. Tell me, Maria Elena, he said, what draws you specifically to Italian culture? Many students choose Spanish or French as easier options. Actually, it started with a cookbook, she admitted with a laugh. My roommate bought this Italian cookbook at a yard sale, and all the recipes were written in Italian. I was curious about the language behind the food, so I started trying to translate them. There was something about the way the instructions were written. They weren't just recipes. They were little stories about families and traditions. Don Giuseppe's eyes lit up with genuine delight. Ah, this is beautiful. You discovered what many people never understand. That language is not just words, but culture, history, emotion. When my mother gave recipes, she never measured anything. She would say, add flour until it feels like grandmother's hands, or cook until it sounds like singing. Exactly, Maria Elena exclaimed, leaning forward with enthusiasm. That's what I loved about those recipes. They assumed you understood not just the language, but the whole world behind it. Their conversation was flowing so naturally that Maria Elena almost forgot where she was. Don Giuseppe was an engaging storyteller, and his enthusiasm for his heritage was infectious. He began sharing more personal stories, about learning to make wine with his father, about the feast days when the whole village would celebrate together, about the ancient traditions that connected generations. In my village, he said, his voice taking on a dreamy quality, there was an old woman named Nonna Carmela who could predict the weather by the way her cat sat on the windowsill. She taught me that wisdom comes not from books, but from paying attention to the small details of life. That's beautiful, Maria Elena said softly. Do you think she was really psychic, or just very observant? Don Giuseppe chuckled. Perhaps there is no difference. She lived 97 years in the same house, watching the same sky, the same seasons, the same patterns. By the end, she knew every secret that place had to tell. As their conversation continued, Maria Elena noticed that more and more people were drifting closer to their seating area. Even those who were still engaged in other conversations seemed to be listening with one ear to what Don Giuseppe was saying. She realized that many of these people probably rarely got to hear him speak so openly about his personal history. You know, Don Giuseppe said thoughtfully, you remind me of someone I knew many years ago, a teacher in my village who could make anyone feel comfortable sharing their stories. She had this gift of asking exactly the right questions to help people open up. What happened to her? Maria Elena asked. She lived a long, full life surrounded by people who loved her. She died at 92, and half the village came to her funeral. That is the kind of legacy worth having, to be remembered for the way you made people feel valued. There was a moment of comfortable silence as they both reflected on his words. Then Don Giuseppe surprised her by switching back to Italian. Sai, Maria Elena, he said, his voice becoming more serious. La mia famiglia non è sempre stata compresa da tutti. Molte persone giudicano senza conoscere la vera storia. Maria Elena understood that he was telling her his family wasn't always understood by everyone, that people judged without knowing the real story. She sensed this was important, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Ogni famiglia ha la sua storia complessa, she replied carefully. What matters is how we treat each other with respect and kindness. Don Giuseppe smiled at her response, but there was something deeper in his expression now. Sì, esatto. Tu capisci qualcosa che molti adulti non riescono a capire. The conversation was interrupted by Antonio's return, this time accompanied by several other family members. Maria Elena found herself being introduced to Don Giuseppe's daughter-in-law, two of his grandsons, and what appeared to be a nephew. Each introduction was conducted with unusual formality, and she noticed that Antonio seemed to be explaining who she was in rapid Italian to each new arrival. Papa, Antonio said eventually, perhaps we should let Maria Elena return to her friends. I'm sure they're wondering where she is. But Don Giuseppe waved off the suggestion. They can wait a few more minutes. I am enjoying this conversation too much to end it now. It was then that one of the grandsons, a young man probably close to Maria Elena's own age, asked a question that would change everything. No, he said. Why don't you tell Maria Elena about the family business? I bet she'd be interested in how you built everything from nothing. The question seemed to create a ripple of tension through the group. Antonio shot his son a warning look, but Don Giuseppe simply smiled. The family business, he repeated slowly, looking directly at Maria Elena. What do you think our family business might be, my dear? Maria Elena felt like she was walking into a minefield without a map. She looked around at the faces watching her and realized that everyone was waiting for her answer with unusual intensity. I honestly don't know, she said carefully. But whatever it is, it's clearly been successful enough to bring all these people together in this beautiful place to celebrate your family. Don Giuseppe's smile widened, and he began to laugh, not mockingly, but with genuine appreciation. Perfetto, he exclaimed, clapping his hands together. Do you hear that, everyone? This young woman understands what truly matters. Not what we do, but who we are, how we treat each other, how we honor our family. He stood up suddenly and raised his glass. I want everyone to listen, he called out in a voice that immediately commanded the attention of the entire room. Tonight, I have had the pleasure of meeting someone very special. Maria Elena, would you please stand? Maria Elena felt her cheeks burning as she reluctantly got to her feet. Every person in the room was now looking directly at her, and the silence was complete. This young woman, Don Giuseppe continued, has spent the evening treating an old man with kindness, curiosity, and respect. She asked about my stories not because she wanted something from me, but because she genuinely cared about understanding my life and my culture. He turned to Maria Elena and continued in Italian, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Maria Elena, tu hai dimostrato oggi qualcosa che molti hanno dimenticato. Hai dimostrato che la vera ricchezza non viene dal potere o dal denaro, ma dalla capacità di connettere con altri esseri umani, con compassione e rispetto. Hai onorato la mia famiglia e la mia storia con la tua attenzione genuina. As he spoke, Maria Elena could see the surprise on the faces around the room. Many of the guests clearly understood Italian, and several were exchanging amazed glances. When Don Giuseppe finished speaking, the room remained silent for several long moments. Then, slowly, someone began to applaud. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in thunderous applause, with several people calling out, "Brava!" and other expressions of approval. Maria Elena stood frozen, overwhelmed by the response, and still not entirely certain what had just happened. Don Giuseppe took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You have honored me tonight, cara mia," he said quietly, using the Italian term of endearment. "And in doing so, you have honored yourself." As the applause finally died down and conversations resumed, Maria Elena found herself surrounded by people wanting to meet her and compliment her Italian. Many of them spoke to her in Italian, clearly testing her abilities, and seemed impressed by her fluent responses. It wasn't until much later, when Jessica pulled her aside with wide eyes and a pale face, that Maria Elena began to understand the full significance of what had occurred. "Elena," Jessica whispered urgently, "do you have any idea what just happened? Do you know who that man is? What his family does?" But as Maria Elena looked back across the room at Don Giuseppe, who was now surrounded by family members but caught her eye and gave her a warm smile and a small wave, she realized that it didn't matter what she had learned about his identity or his family's reputation. What mattered was that she had treated him as a human being, with dignity and genuine interest, and he had responded in kind. Sometimes the most profound moments in life come not from grand gestures or carefully planned events, but from simple acts of kindness between strangers who choose to see past surface appearances and connect as human beings. Maria Elena had walked into that mansion as a nervous college student and left as someone who had learned that respect and compassion could bridge any gap, no matter how unlikely the circumstances. The evening had taught her that every person carries stories worth hearing, regardless of who they are or what others might think of them. And sometimes, speaking someone's language, both literally and figuratively, can open doors to understanding that change both people forever.